Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So we have a full house tonight, which means that I believe we are going to beat that three of a kind. So to my right, Tracy Baggiano,
Good
newly
evening.
minted MVP.
Thank you.
To my southerly direction, Mala Mahadevan.
Hello, everyone.
To my cardinal direction, Tom Norman.
Good evening, everyone.
That makes Tom the state bird of like half of the states in the U.S.
Yeah.
So he's got that going for him. So, the idea behind Shop Talk is the interactive chat show. We want to hear your questions, your takes on things. I will throw out topics like grenades and watch them explode. And we've got a few topics tonight that I want to hit. But if you have questions, you want our thoughts on things, drop them in chat, because it's your show ultimately. Which means that I think all the production value problems are also your problem. At least that's what my producer tells me. So with that, let's talk about our first topic. So something I wanted to bring up, not just because I just posted a video and blog post on it today, but transaction modes. So there are a couple of transaction modes in SQL Server. And the one we're all familiar with is auto commit. Auto commit is essentially, I write a statement, let's say an insert statement. Behind the scenes, my client will open a transaction, perform the operation, close the transaction. I don't explicitly write out anything to begin to manage that transaction. It happens behind the scenes. We know this happens because, well, transactions are are a big part of how SQL Server is able to follow ACID properties, especially atomicity. Either a thing happens or it doesn't. It doesn't partially happen. There are a couple of other modes for transactions. And the other really popular mode is explicit. This is where I say begin transaction, I do all of the work that I need to do in that transaction, and then I commit or I roll back. There's a third mode, implicit transactions. And implicit transactions are going to be pretty familiar to you if you work in Oracle, like if you use SQL Plus, because their implicit transactions, at least last time I worked on Oracle, which is approximately forever ago, their implicit transactions are on by default. Implicit transactions essentially say when you have an operation, it will open a transaction for you. In SQL Server, that transaction opens up on an operation that modifies data or tables. So it won't open on a select, but it will on an update or a merge or a truncate or a create or a drop. And you are responsible at the end for writing commit or rollback, but you don't have to write begin transaction. Now, funny thing I learned in the making of that video was I tried to do all my examples in Azure Data Studio, and I could not get the implicit transactions demo to work. I believe that in Azure Data Studio, implicit transactions just don't work at all. And personally, I have no problem with that because implicit transactions are a bane on our existence. Thankfully, they're a bane that nobody knows about. So, got that going for us. So, that premise laid out, wanted to ask everybody, where do you stand? Do you prefer auto commit over explicit transactions? Do you prefer explicit transactions in certain cases and auto commit in others? Do you have a hard opinion on anything? Do you actually use implicit transactions and why? And do you use batch scoped transactions? And if so, I feel really bad because Mars was a horrible idea. Or at least it was a horrible implementation. I'll let you decide which one that is.
So I always use explicit transactions because I've been burned by not doing that. It's a habit ingrained in me, and I have really not found that many scenarios where I don't need it, or to put it another way, I don't think it hurts anybody anything to use an explicit transaction and do it that way. There's no extra cost involved not doing it, and it is a safety net that most of the time we are grateful for. That is, I mean, this when I run queries explicitly, in Management Studio. But when I write code, if there is not anything unexpected that I think can happen, and it's just a simple statement, then I think it's fine. Fine to not use it. Yeah.
Okay.
But the scope of that can expand over time. So, generally speaking, if you're 100% certain this is just one update that's never going to hurt anything, then by all means don't use it. That's all. And the third option I didn't even know existed, Kevin. I just learned that.
Yeah, so summarizing Mala's statement because of all of my frame drops, basically Mala is a big fan of explicit transactions, and that's a fair point. It is a good place to be in, especially that one time when you write the update statement and you accidentally forget the where clause, or where your where clause is joining, linking to itself. So where i.id equals i.id. Those,
Yeah.
not that that's ever happened to me.
I favor the explicit transaction as well, because I normally just have a template that I drop my code into, and it already has all the transaction code into it. And
That
then
helps.
I can determine when it rollbacks and commits. But it also depends on what company I work for, because some companies don't have the standards set up that way. They will tell you to use auto commit if you only have one transaction, so that they have less code to look at.
Right. So
Just-
Icon Pro mentioned before. Sorry, I'm going to keep cutting everybody off. My job to cut people off. Just wrapped a third-party stored procedure in a try-catch block with commit and rollback. The stored procedure would crash in the middle of a bunch of inserts, leaving the caller rimrocked. We could not alter the stored procedure because of copyright, so we wrapped it. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of case that explicit transactions were meant to work for, where, oh, you ran this procedure and it's got to either complete or not have run, not halfway through leaving you with some of the tables with data filled out and some of them with data missing. That's just that's a bad state to be in.
Mine is it depends. I use a mixture. If I need to use, most of the time, I am using just the auto commit because I'm updating one row, on a table or whatever. But if I'm needing a set of tables to all basically have been successfully committed, then I'll use begin transaction. So it just depends. Sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't.
Yeah, so in your case, if I'm reframing it, use explicit transactions when you have multiple interconnected data modification statements.
Correct.
Okay, I mean that's an obvious case where it's really a good idea to have. So Raymond asks, it depends what's preferred on lengthy calculations. Think monthly billing with contracts with 10,000 lines. So where lengthy means you have an enormous stored procedure, arguably I'd say explicit transactions at the very least force you to think about a couple of things. They make you think about, what do I want to include in the transaction? Knowing that while I have this transaction open and I've taken out locks, I've utilized resources, I'm going to hold these things until the transaction commits or rolls back. So I want to do this with as little footprint as possible, usually. And as a result, I want to think about, well, how much work am I doing within the scope of the transaction itself? If a vast majority of my work can be done before that final insert, update, delete, then I don't need to have any of that in an explicit transaction, and I keep it out of the transaction. I keep it as like working in temp tables or building up the result set that I need, and then have to have match what my final output will look like. So it allows me to focus my thoughts a bit and take out everything that's not part of the final transaction, which helps improve the performance of that final transaction piece. Because now it's essentially, well, let's say it's an update operation. I'm now just going to update joining to my end table against a temp table I've created, where I've got that table. It's already got keys matching up. Everything's all prepped, and it is a really easy join. Not so much effort going on there. It'll be a very fast update, most likely, or at least as fast as I could possibly make it. And by contrast, if you just rely on auto commit, it can become easier for me to say, well, you know, I'm just adding a couple more joins. I'm just making this just a little bit more. There's not a big deal here. And a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and then you hit a tipping point where everything slows down. So this is a way of enforcing mental separation. And it also, in a coder view, lets you think, this is the dangerous zone. You know, the stuff beforehand, obviously, you'll need to review it, you'll need to understand it in order to see what's updating. But in here, in this zone, this is where we're actually changing data. So if you're able to get that style enforced, then you can see, hey, wait, this is an update, like this is an update procedure, but I don't see an explicit transaction. What's going on here? Or this is a select procedure and I see an explicit transaction. What's going on here? So yes, we break up the billing steps. Yeah, that does make sense. So hopefully that is a vague non-answer for you, Raymond. I mean, it's like Tom says, it does depend. And for me, if I'm just writing stuff in Management Studio or in Azure Data Studio, I'll begin a transaction explicitly if I think I'm gonna make my day really bad if I mess up. So if it's a dev table and I don't really care about the data in there, YOLO. If it's a table where I actually do care about the data, oh yeah, begin transaction up front.
Yeah, it also matters, of course, the environment that you're in, you know, whether you're in production or where you're at. There are just so many different things that you kind of look at when you decide that. You know, one of the things we have to have, Kevin, is when we're putting in a data change ticket into production, we need to have basically a rollback script. So, you know, that's just part of the approval process. So, you know, a begin tran, end tran definitely would roll it back for you. But a lot of times we actually have to have the physical script in there and say, okay, what are we going to do to roll it back if it did get all the way committed?
Yeah, that's a practice that I would say is a very good practice that I almost exclusively avoid. But not because it's a bad thing. It's a lot of effort.
It is a lot of effort. Yeah.
But if you are in an environment where you have to have that level of either risk aversion or that speed of fixing a problem, like it needs to be fixed as soon as possible because when it's down, we're losing a lot of money. Oh yeah, you spend that time up front and you say, suppose this thing goes completely haywire. How do we get it back to a prior state and as quickly as possible so that we can diagnose what happened? So yeah,
right, exactly.
And that's sort of I'll call it a roll forward rollback, where you're not really rolling back a transaction. You're actually moving forward to a state that looked like a prior state. It's advancing in reverse. I am still dropping frames, so hopefully this is not too awful tonight. We'll see. We'll see how it turns out. If it's so bad that I'm stammering and stuttering even more than usual, which is admittedly a lot, let me know, and we'll restart my router, and I don't know, sacrifice a duck. Got a couple of them in the freezer. Okay, so I think we solved the world of transactions, at least transaction modes. And thinking about whether or not there was anything else to add to the topic, but my mind is blank. That's going to get clipped someday. Someone's going to use that against me in the future. It's all right. It's all right. I'll probably use it against myself. Okay, let's talk about the next topic. So Mala brought up this topic and wanted to be very clear that this was not her opinion. Very clear, it's not her opinion. The question is, oh, save points. Oh, so TG brings up save points. Yeah, before I get to this thing, let me rant for a while about nested transactions. The people who put nested transactions into SQL Server did an awful job of halfway implementing an already kind of harebrained idea. And save points don't really help it very much. It's the idea that I can go 5 deep into a transaction, commit 3 times, and then roll back once, and now I'm at a tran count of 0 and everything rolled back. It makes no sense. It makes sense only in the way that it's still atomic, so yes, the whole thing was one transaction, but then why even have multiple transactions? Those inner nested transactions do nothing useful. And that should have just essentially said, if tran count is greater than 0, you can type in begin tran all you want, and it never does anything. Just for the record, I did not say that I would use or recommend them. That's fair. That's fair. It's I get the feeling that they were put in place because Oracle has something similar that actually works, and some customer probably said, we need nested transactions. The SQL Server developer said, that's a really bad idea. The big name customer said, too bad, we use them, we need them. And the SQL Server developer's like, okay, sure, we'll give you nested transactions. They'll totally nest. Another feature, named transactions. So named transactions are kind of interesting. I still wouldn't really use them. I mean, same thing with save points. It's the type of thing that was like halfway implemented, doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense.
Now, the one use case I've seen for a name transaction was a tool. I mean, there have been a couple of tools, but one, I think, if I recall right, I think it came with Toad, or I don't know when. It's been a few years. But if you have a log reader tool of some kind that that you use now and then it's really easy to find a name transaction in that, because it's a lot of content otherwise without it. And that's the only use case I've seen personally, is if you're using log reader tools to find out, what somebody did or something that happened, yesterday and stuff like that, then it's useful.
Yeah, oh, that's actually an interesting case. Yeah, if you're reading through transaction log entries. Okay, that's fair. It's a little bit out there, but makes a lot of sense. Solomon mentions that you can roll back to a save point, but can't think of a scenario where you would want to acknowledge an error and only want to undo part of the work. So if it worked in its ideal form, like if it actually did work correctly and completely correctly, I could see something like, I tried to insert in here, but I got a deadlock. So I'm just going to try it again. So let's roll back to the prior bit of work because I want all of this to work correctly. I don't want to be in a weird situation. And we're going to pick it up again. I could kind of see that scenario. But if I remember right, rolling back to save points, it was something like in a lot of rollback scenarios, even if you thought the transaction was still open, the transaction essentially it killed itself, and
Okay.
you,
You should just handle that scenario in the application, because then you're keeping stuff open too long anyways on the SQL Server side and blocking stuff and causing more deadlocks from the first part of the transaction.
yeah.
So just do what you normally do, get out, let the application retry.
Yes.
If you're
yes.
doing it in that scenario.
If it's mostly the app, like if it's the application doing it. Now, if it's a behind the scenes script where, say, a DBA is running this to do some work, then there may not be an application behind it. But I've admittedly, it's been a while since I've worked with save points. Like, I played with them about a decade ago to learn how they worked and have forgotten most of the mechanics behind it since. But I do remember that in a lot of rollback cases, the transact abort status would be set. The flag would be set even after you roll back and you thought you were in a reasonable position, and you could not go forward. You could only roll back. But
Yeah, I had this stuff at one time and it just did not work the way they thought they were programming it. We got inconsistent data all the time, and I had to rip it apart and write it correctly.
yeah. So it seems like the type of thing that has been around in the database engine for a couple of decades, and frankly isn't going to change and doesn't really work very well. Maybe there is a scenario that somebody comes up with and says, it actually works really well for me. And in that case, great. I've not seen that scenario. Although I do like Mala's case of named transactions for log reading. That was an interesting use case for it. So let's hit the next topic, next high point here. Again, this is not Mala's fault. She just brought up the topic. What is the maximum number of joins you would want to see in a single query? So there's a discussion going on, and the question was based around some fairly complicated queries and probably performing poorly, maybe involving Entity Framework, and Entity Framework is a train wreck. But this person's opinion was that SQL Server doesn't really handle joins that well. So TG jumps in immediately and says infinity plus 1. I'm kind of in that boat. Anybody else wanna chime in with your thoughts on how many indexes, or excuse me, not how many indexes, how many joins? How many joins does it take to get to the root of a performance problem?
It depends.
I see
Yep.
Tom's got a mantra tonight.
That's what all good
So,
DBAs said.
yeah, it really depends upon how many rows that each table has. Like if you're doing a bunch of joins against a bunch of reference or enum tables, then you're not having as much performance problem with those because there's very little rows. So it really depends.
If you're going to join to like your largest table in your database and it's got 500,000 rows in it and you're joining like 5 tables to it and then you got another 500,000, no, that's just too much data. Pull what you need into temp tables and then join the temp tables together and get what you need done, because you're liable to only pull out like 1,000 rows out of that 500,000.
So Solomon has the best answer. 20 to 30, but they must all be to views that have 20 plus joins.
They
They
almost
almost
what?
be what?
So 20 to 30 joins is your maximum, but every one of those things joined has to be a view that itself is made up of 20 to 30 joins. Now, I would go a few layers deeper, Solomon, and say that you have to have at least like 5 or 6 layers of nested views for this really to pay off. And if you do it right, I'm pretty sure there's a secret prize in SQL Server. So give that a try in your production environments.
Yep. There's probably an Easter egg in there somewhere.
Yeah. I think it's called an unyielding scheduler Easter egg.
Yeah, it's got a bug. Well, one that can't be squashed because you wrote something that's terrible, or it has insufficient memory to create a query plan for this query.
Yep, that's your bug. That's not even a bug. That's
That's
your
even a
Easter
bug.
egg.
It's just like,
Yeah. So, it does depend. You know, we're going to talk about factors like how much memory do you have, how much concurrency do you have, your data model. If you're talking about a warehouse, I may have a fact joining to 15 to 20 dimensions and not blink an eye because those joins tend to be point lookups against, like Tom said, fairly small tables. And the number of joins by itself isn't so much of a problem. Nesting views is a horrible problem.
Yes.
Types of joins that happen, how you're filtering out records absolutely is an issue. Raymond asks with indexes or not, and that's a good question. That's another factor to play in there. That are you taking a mega table, but you're filtering out on a really good index and getting a tiny subsection of it, and then joining to a bunch of different tables. As long as the execution plan looks good.
It actually used the index you wanted it to use too.
Yeah. Now you can end up
without ending it.
Right. You can end up with weird execution plans as a result of having huge numbers of joins, because if you don't have a really good plan up front, then the optimizer may have a timeout and just pick whichever one was best given the quintillion or so options. So that's a possibility.
So I missed a couple of minutes. My take on this is similar to Tom. I think it's very strongly it depends. I have seen developers overdo it simply because they want to get everything done in one big query instead of thinking through the whole thing and understanding if this actually requires a join, or is it just something you can get beforehand or afterhand, in a more efficient way, and that kind of stuff. So it goes both ways. Things have been underdone too. People who are very procedural tend to have too many queries in there. So finding the right balance, I personally, I don't think it's anything to do with SQL Server not being able to do it a certain way or anything. It's more to do with programming efficiency than anything else.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. PG says it's not just how many tables, it depends on the number of rows and join conditions. Like if you have cases with nested case statements in the on clause, that's a problem. If designed and indexed well, you can join 50 to 60 tables. If you do it badly, you can kill SQL with a few tables. True. Nested views are usually a killer because it's very likely the same table is there many times, and that confuses the query optimizer quite a bit. The other factor is once you get enough tables in the nested views, even if it's not repeating the same tables over and over, you may end up in cases where you should be able to eliminate a table, and it would eliminate the table if you just called the bottom view itself. But because the query becomes so complex, the optimizer essentially just says, whatever, here, take all the tables, bring them all in, even though we're not going to use some of these and can't use some of these, we're still going to bring them in, bring all their data in. So that is another pain point. Repetition, absolutely, also a pain point, because the optimizer, instead of saying, well, wait, you have four views, all of which have the same 3 tables joined together and all have the same filters. I could use that data once, maybe put it into a spool if I need to, but just have them all together once and then simplify this query. And nest it deep enough, and the optimizer just says, whatever. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. That is the motto of the optimizer. It's kind of a jerk. How about column store type tables? Multiple tables with similar type column stores. So if you're driving from a column store fact table, I think it behaves, in this case, the behavior is going to be close enough that I would say doesn't really change things much. May change performance considerably, but wouldn't change my advice on do you join or not join. I'm with Mala where, look, my default is I'm just going to make all the joins. Well, here, I won't say I'm with Mala. I'll say this is my opinion, and we'll see who agrees. I'm going to make all the joins up front. If I see a performance problem, then I'll break things out. But my thought is simplest first. Here is, say, a fact table, huge bunches of joins against, get my result that I want. If the performance is good, if the query plan looks good, I'm not going to change it. If the query plan doesn't look good, yeah, I'll break things out. Joining 2 column stores is a nightmare. SQL needs to do a hash join on large data sets. Yes. There aren't many options that the optimizer could do there except a hash join. The only way it could do something else would be if you had a non-column store index on that table. So if you're using the column store index to join, yeah, hash match is about all you're going to get. If you're joining column store to column store. But yeah, my philosophy there is write the query that gets you the results you need. See if that's good enough. If it's good enough, if it's fast enough, if it works well for you, if it doesn't hurt your environment, if it does everything fine, I don't need to break anything out. But if it does, then yeah, break stuff out, simplify things down, remove some joins. And that's where, for example, I may take, if I filter on the fact table, I may pull out the 250,000 or 500,000 candidate rows, drop them into a temp table that is indexed for my query, and then join that to the dimension tables instead of joining the fact table to dimension tables directly. If it's a case where I'm getting hash matches applied before the filter, for example. And that's where I may just say, fine, instead of trying to nudge it with hints or bludgeon it with hints, let's just essentially in a roundabout way, tell the optimizer what it should have done passive aggressively. Get back at that optimizer. Any additional thoughts here?
Nope, not from
I think
me.
we covered it all.
So, yeah, that covers that topic, and I think there is a difference in transactional versus warehouse. Simple tends to be better. Yeah, I have 2 differing and somewhat contradictory ideas of what simple means, Raymond, where there's simple from the standpoint of I've got it in one query. It's a simple operation, relatively few lines of code. it may not necessarily be simple in the sense of imperative, that reptilian imperative brain that programmers have, where we want to do things step by step by step. And so those two definitions of simplicity can be at odds. And this is a case where they are at odds. And I can say my simpler case of one query, and somebody else can legitimately say my simpler case of 6 queries. And we both use the term correctly, just meaning completely different things. Oh, I hate. So TG says something that this is one of those things where it actually causes me to riot. The old phrase, normalize till it hurts, denormalize till it works. And where it gets me is, I'm not accusing you of this, TG. Where it gets me is that there are so many developers who think normalization just means more tables and don't actually understand the rules behind normalization. They couldn't spell Boyce cod, much less implement it, and use that phrase as, well, really normalized databases don't work. Like, no, they generally do, and they generally work really well. It's just you have to understand what normalization means, and you have to understand the domain model. And if your product doesn't work with a properly designed database, then it may not necessarily be the database's fault. It may be the implementer's fault in thinking that either they've got some crazy domain problems, not including something that needs to be included as a domain element, mixing together entities, or splitting apart entities that really should be together. These are all things that a person may come up with and say, yep, this looks fine. And it's really not a good data model at all. And all right, I see where you're saying with OLTP and warehouse and data mart. I don't consider the Kimball model when I'm talking specifically about normalization, because my joke is that the Kimball model says take all the rules of normalization and reverse them. But BI people really don't like that joke very much. So I'm thinking specifically from a transactional processing system. If you start talking warehousing, then yes, normalization is not the right model for that. But the benefits around warehousing, especially in the Kimball model of facts and dimensions, they're not really in write performance or write integrity. They're in simplicity for business users. And in that case, the Kimball model requires so many external constraints. You have to have robot dogs guarding the entrances, preventing people from messing with your data. Because
so that talk that Kellis gave, Kevin, at the summit
What's
on
that?
modeling tables for the data warehouse, that's worth listening to. I think I wish I had a list of the things he recommended there, but that was amazing.
Yeah. That is true. That was a good talk. And it's like the Kimball model absolutely works. It solves a particular set of things, but I don't consider that denormalizing the model, because it's a different data structure altogether. You still have the transactional system model, which should be appropriately normalized, and if you have the business elements in the design set up correctly, I don't think there are many cases in which you really need to do much, if any, denormalization on a real production scenario. That you're generally going to have better performance with appropriately normalized databases. And that's the thing that causes developers to say, no, you can't be right. But when you think about the number of things like stored procedures that update 8 different tables, and we have to update them several times, or I need to scan through this table and update all of the cases where this was marked. And those are the types of things that simply being in first and second normal form gets you around. So Raven says it depends on the pain points you want. Yeah, life is full of trade-offs. Everything in computer science is a trade-off. There are no miracles. Except for, what was it? The fact that cache hits tend to be nearly contiguous. I had a computer science professor who said there was only one miracle in computer science, and that was when you had cache hits, they tended to be on the same pages of memory. That's the only thing we got going. Computer engineers, they got to make new miracles every day, but we don't get miracles. We just get trade-offs. Okay, so I think I'm all ranted out on normalization. I'm very passionate about normalization. I think, unfortunately, it's a dead art, and it's become, well, let's just throw more resources at it. We'll create some more tables,
Very true.
We'll deal with the problems that fall out from it. So Mala, you have books. Your books are better than my book choices, my book hovel.
No, so yeah, I have 2 books, like I always do. The first one is Performance Tuning with SQL Server Dynamic Management Views with Louis Davidson and Tim Ford. And this is one of the few technical books that is old but still worth keeping in your library. This is about 8 years old. I think they originally published it in 2010 and they republished it again 2 years later, and I think after that they stopped. But the reason why I keep it is because this is an extremely well-written, well-organized book. It just doesn't give you a list of DMVs and go on to say, this one does that one does this and that. But they've actually grouped it into really neat categories, like, what do you want to look at if you're tuning an index? What do you want to look at if you have a problem related to an OS? What do you want to look at if you have some transactional related stuff going on? So there is all these neat groupings or buckets into which they've divided this. Of course, there are a lot more DMVs now than there were, 8 years ago, but still. It's if you need a quick reference, if you're having a problem and you don't recall what exactly or what are the DMVs involved off the top of your head, you can go and look at it. I use Glenberry's queries a lot, so I don't use the queries in this book. But I do look up this book when I have to go and see, hey, what are the DMVs involved that I need to be using for this particular purpose? And it's an excellent reference for that reason. And it's still valid. It's still good.
Yeah. So, now there are a lot of DMVs that have come out since then, like you mentioned. I mean, that was written, I think, for the 2008 R2 edition of SQL Server.
Yeah. But I still keep it because it's such a well-written book.
Yeah.
Okay. The next book is one on professional growth. It is called Tiny Changes, Remarkable Results: Atomic Habits by James Clear. It looks like a big book, but it's large print and you can get through it pretty quickly. And he explains how it's a concept that most people know, that you have to start small whenever you're trying to grow habits. Don't make a big decision to do something tomorrow, or it is self-sabotage. And you have to start small in small incremental steps and see where you're going with it. Give yourself rewards. And he has a ton of stories or case studies that he narrates, and he makes the argument that most successful people are not because they are geniuses or something that nobody else have. It's only because they built a lot of habits that sustain them over time, that good habits that keep them going in the right direction. So it's an interesting book. It's worth a read, and he has some tools, tips, and techniques that you can take away for you to grow your own little habits and take it from there. I've been using some of the things that he has taught me, especially the positive reinforcement with letting your mind know that this is actually working instead of keeping doing it every day. That I found that technique very useful. So it's a
Okay.
good book, and there is a podcast on the book too. If you don't have time to get through a big book, I don't have what it is off the top of my head, but I'll find it and give it to Kevin to put it in his notes.
I am pulling that up right now. I believe it might be the Intra Leadership podcast. Maybe. It looks like it's by James Clear. So if you do want a podcast, here is a link to iTunes, which you can actually, I guess it's Apple Podcasts now. Let's not use the I word anymore. But that might be related. Find out if it's related. Somebody let me know if it's related. It may take a while to find out if it's related. The last topic on my agenda for tonight. Again, if you have questions, may have answered. So you want to write a book. Our main meeting this month is Kathy Kellenberger, and she is going to talk to us, not tomorrow, but next Tuesday, about technical writing. Writing for blogs, writing articles for websites, even writing books. And a lot of the ins and outs of that. So I maybe should have saved this topic for next week, but it's been on my agenda for a minute. So
I highly recommend Kathy's talk here for anyone who wants to, who is not into speaking or wants to write more, because she is the editor of Simple Talk. She really knows her stuff very well when it comes to technical writing.
yes. She's author of several books. Been doing this for a minute. Has a great amount of knowledge built up. Definitely, even if you're not interested, just come show up just to see what the world is like for people who have to write long form technical stuff. It is a lot harder than it looks. Particularly
And edit
when
the crap everybody else writes
yeah, well, particularly when you think
when
about
they walk away with the money.
wait, there's money in technical work?
Yeah, where? Where is that money at?
Simple Talk is the only place where you can say safely that there is money, not anywhere else. Simple
Yeah.
Talk pays very decent money. Yeah.
Oh no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
One of the trickiest things about technical writing, at least from what I've experienced doing a few projects, is that you have to work from the assumption that the other person knows nothing about what is in your brain at this time. And it is so easy to just start making these implicit assumptions where you're writing and, well, I had to change this code, but, I'm just going to keep writing. And now you have this disjoint where you started writing a couple of paragraphs and you may have mentioned something that's no longer in the code. Having to go back, clean that up, or having to think about what are the steps for setting up a SQL Server instance. Next, of course. But actually, even now, you can't do next anymore. You have to walk through the steps, and the assumptions that people make. Oh, well, you're gonna set your collation. Well, that may not necessarily come to mind for a person, and down the road, you may have a problem because the default collation is so bad. But many of us on here. So, Tom, have you done technical writing for pay before?
I have not. Nope.
That's fine. But you've done a lot of internal documentation. Yes, you have.
Yeah, some. Yeah.
You've done
I've
presentations.
got a blog that I've done some, short articles, but nothing long.
Sure, and you've done presentations. You've
Yeah.
built trainings. You were in the process of building a training. So
Correct.
Mala, I know you have
So
published
I
a
was
book.
supposed to present a talk at New Stars of Data, the event that our German friends are putting together. But because of my health condition, I could not get the talk ready on time, and that is on database documentation. Hopefully, I will be able to finish it in time and present to our user group in the upcoming months.
Yeah.
So I'm very passionate about documentation, and I've been stuck with being the sole person who writes up stuff in multiple jobs. So I am a little careful about that nowadays before I volunteer myself for it, because you can be stuck with a lot of stuff that nobody else wants to do. So the second lesson I've learned too is that always write if there are people who want to read. And that's kind of a catch-22 situation. Sometimes people get around to reading it if you write really well, but you can also put a lot of effort into creating something that nobody wants to take a second look because they think everything they need to know is in their head.
Mm-hmm.
So be careful of both scenarios. But I really am a big fan of properly documented stuff. It can save a lot of time.
Right. And Tracy is a noted noted author, not a publisher as far as I know.
No.
But noted author and scholar.
Maybe not that last part either.
Noted author and person.
There we go. Two things we can agree on.
There we go. All right.
Writing a book's a lot of work.
Yes. It is. So when you wrote
You wrote a book as well, Kevin, so don't slide out of this as well. You get to put some input in.
I've written a
You're
book,
just taking
I've
yourself for
created
laughs.
workshops. There's been
Let's
there,
not
done
open the can of book writing worms.
Yeah.
Generally, I think that era is past. That's my opinion. Unless you're writing something very unique.
Yeah. So, how much time and effort was it? So, Mala, you ended up doing a book of interviews and also had worked on a book for a project that didn't quite take off. How much time and effort?
I don't want to, get into a lot of details, but I did suggest to one publisher. There is there's a really neat project that O'Reilly Books is doing on 97 things database engineers need to know. It's a community project. They solicit people to submit 1 or 2 pages of what they think, and then if they like what you submit, then it's going to be included as part of the book. I don't think anybody gets any money, but it's included as part of the book. So people like their names on a book even now. That's perhaps the only reason that everybody wants to write. So that was one idea I suggested at least to one publisher who didn't agree with me. And he said, I said, you don't have to make it 97, which seems a lot of entries to me, but at least a collection of community submitted entries would make for something interesting. But he didn't agree with me. So I don't know what his challenges are from a publisher's point of view. Maybe having a certain person's name on the book as the sole author is something that they have to live by for whatever reason. But I didn't think, as I'm sure all of you would agree who have written books, is that the enormous effort involved is worth the payoffs in the end. The kind of the old-fashioned book writing strategy where one person sits on a tech topic and dishes out of 8 months or 12 months, I think that is dated. And I tried my best to explain that. Don't know, I failed. Don't know. Maybe they have their reasons they can explain.
Yeah, if you do the math, you're earning about $5 an hour, $6 an hour writing a book. It's not very much. Maybe it's a bit more if you're a rather popular author. You've written a few books before. This is technical works, so we're not talking nonfiction or like biographies. We're not talking fictional stuff. Well, yeah. Depends on how interesting you write your database books. But
so in my mind, the reason why you can write is if you have an evergreen topic. So just a little while ago, Kevin talked of normalization. So something like that, that's not going to die anytime soon, and you have a fresh take on something. I think CJ Date has a new edition of his book. I haven't seen what it is yet, but something like that would be worth writing a book on, that is going to last a long, long time, and architecture or, that kind of concepts. But technical stuff and things that keep changing now, I don't know. I'm not sure it's worth the effort.
Tough call. So Raymond asks,
Azure would be a hard one to write because it's constantly changing.
Yeah. Yes, actually, behind me, got my copy of Learning Azure in a Month of Lunches. Just publishing from Manning is a book on something or another in Azure, and they're gonna be dated. Like there's one that's data engineering with Azure, and they spend a lot of time on USQL. I'm thinking USQL's a dead language. It might have been dead when they started the book. It probably wasn't quite dead yet then, but like that's a chapter I don't have to read. Right. PG says the effort also depends on publisher and which tools they require you to use, like Word versus actual typesetting software that was designed to handle large documents like books. Yeah. Now, if you start asking me to do all my code in LaTeX, that may be a little tricky. But what's interesting is Chrissy Lemaire and Rob Sewell are they're publishing a book through Manning on DBA tools in a month of lunches. And Chrissy was doing live streams for a while of different chapters, and it looks like all of her stuff is written in Markdown.
Yep, she's writing hers in Markdown.
That is a pretty convenient idea.
Because it tells you how the language works and that lays out the concepts. And I think I like the Book of Lunches stuff, although it's not exactly reference material. It's more for tutorial kind of learning, but I still like it.
Yeah, and using Markdown for that, I think, is a reasonably good way of doing it. You can, especially using tools like VS Code, there are Markdown editors. There are helpers with Markdown. You can type in a few letters and get a table of contents built for you. So those types of things can help out the life considerably. Using Pandocs will help as well. Yeah, Raymond, absolutely right. Pandocs can help there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot smoother than working with Microsoft Word, where the templates can be a little fidgety.
Yeah, you gotta tab it this way and that way.
Right. And you may end up breaking and getting into some other style somehow you didn't mean to, and have to copy out into Notepad and copy it back in, and get a little messy. So how about favorite tools for sharing documents other than Read the Docs and SharePoint?
Not SharePoint.
Yeah, SharePoint.
SharePoint always seems to be, everywhere I've gone, it's so disorganized and you can't find anything.
There's a problem with it. Part of that is a people thing. It's a process thing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But here's a bunch of Word docs or Excel spreadsheets, and yeah, you have to be really diligent about getting into the appropriate domain and the appropriate setup, and you have to have essentially a SharePoint librarian.
Correct.
And I don't know of any companies that have those. I'm sure that there are, but I've not worked at one. So what about tools for sharing documents? I'm kind of at a loss. Read the Docs. I'm not the biggest fan of that, at least as far as automated documentation from code goes. I don't buy that idea very well. But when you do have documentation, how do you get it out to people? Exactly.
You write a blog.
Yeah,
That's
it's
how I've documented some of my processes I've wrote at companies is I blogged about them. That way I could look them up later.
yeah, that might be one way to do it. Even
Because the company didn't have any way for me to store it somewhere where someone could understand it, so or I could find it again later.
right, if you're talking a technical organization, GitHub repo. Here's a GitHub repo with documentation where the documents are markdown files.
Mm-hmm.
That might be enough for teams to work with. Perhaps a set of notebooks if you're in an environment where you've got that Jupyter server set up. Notebooks might be a reasonable way of trying to solve the documentation problem. Wikis, depending on how good the search functionality is, might be helpful. Internal. Read the Docs does have a simple search. It can bring in Ghost or some other tool. Yeah, and maybe so. Like I mentioned, I'm mostly hating on the automated documentation where it's taking XML comments and code and turning them into Autodoc, essentially. I don't mean the site itself or the full service itself, just more of the idea of Autodoc driven documentation. I see too much of that, and like I can pull up so many examples on, say, Microsoft Docs where here's a DMV and the column name is X and the description is does X, where you know that was auto-generated, unhelpful documentation. Content and structure is subjective. Yes, and context is critical there, where maybe I just need the list of columns and I happen to know what everything means. But if I'm coming at this, going back to the point I was saying of assume that the person doesn't know what's in your head, how can I describe that? And developers are really bad at that. Because we're constantly thinking, look, all you have to do is read the code. Okay, well, the source code's hidden. You're not going to let me read it. So that comment that you made, which gets put into a website automatically for an object, whose name maybe makes sense, but not to me, and whose columns, whose attributes are all gobbledygook as far as I can tell, because I don't have the context needed, because I can't read the code, and the documentation is awful. That's where a good human really helps. So with that, looks like we have hit our 8 o'clock hour. I have dropped more frames in this episode than in all the prior episodes combined, so great job, internet provider. Really stepping it up this month. Agreed, hence the writing tool and searching, enabling users to find at their own pace, and a good writer. Good writer is, yeah, I'm 100% with you on that, Raymond. Like I said, Autodoc, if the concept isn't atrocious, all of the implementations from developers are atrocious. When I say all, I'm sure there are examples, there are counterexamples. When I say all, I don't truly mean all. But the vast majority are going to fit in my camp where, and here, developers just don't write documentation well. You should ask Santa for new ISP for Christmas. Yeah, so fun thing about North Carolina is that for cable and DSL providers, different counties essentially provided monopolies to different providers in order to get them to build out the infrastructure. So the catch for here, you're going to lay out all the lines, was then you get to control the service. So there's usually at most one cable company and one DSL company in an area. And Google Fiber stopped like 4 miles away from my house. Still upset about that.
I'm beside the interstate and they never came anywhere near me.
Yeah. They had these grandiose plans that they were going to take the whole entire area, and stuff happened, and well, they got some of the area. Yeah, different parts of like downtown Raleigh, parts of Cary and Apex did get it, but even in Durham, some of the places in Durham got it. A few miles away from me, they have it, but it doesn't come all the way out to me. So, anyhow, with that, we are going to wrap up tonight's episode of Shop Talk. Thanks everybody for hanging out in chat. Great commentary, great ideas. Come by for the next talk. Bring the laptop. Oh, this is a 3-monitor desktop situation. It'll be a filled up car. So tomorrow, James Serra is going to talk to us about Azure Synapse Analytics. Come by and ask him repeatedly why I would want to use that rather than Databricks. I'm sure he'll love that question over and over. 10 yards a day and you'll have fiber in 2 years. This sounds like some sort of Count of Monte Cristo thing you've got going on here, TG. But James Serra tomorrow, check that out. Next Monday, Shop Talk again. Next Tuesday, Kathy Kellenberger on technical writing. And fourth Tuesday, I'm going to set that up on Meetup tonight. So if you want to keep appraised of what's going on with TriPass, go to meetup.org. Meetup.com/TriPass. I keep thinking .org, but meetup.com/TriPass. And if you have questions, send them to shoptalk@tripass.org. With that, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Good evening.
Right.